Welcome. Today I'm going to talk about an obscure 1997 Taiwanese first-person shooter called Mars 3D. It's sometimes just called Mars or by its original Chinese name, which translates into The Ultimate Fighter. This is another one of those games where all of the titles are both generic and terrible for googling. Titles aside, it's a miracle this game is accessible at all. See, Mars 3D holds a very unique distinction among almost every other game playable today, in that it is believed to have never been officially released. A lot about this game's development and release status is a mystery, and the exact reasons why it seemingly never made it to market aren't known. As for how it resurfaced from the grave that it probably should have stayed in, that's a small mystery in its own right. The furthest back I can trace this is to a video showcase on a Duke Nukem forum posted by a user named Player Lin back in 2013. They allegedly received the game from a Chinese person named New Clicker. How New Clicker got the ISO in the first place is unclear. Maybe they were a developer, maybe they found it in a sewer somewhere, I don't know. I suppose it's attracted some modest attention since Mars 3D, in a series of events beyond human understanding, ended up receiving a third-party limited physical re-release coupled with an English translation in 2018. As a bonus, it also got a manual and cover art. Intriguingly, Player Lin is listed in the credits for this new translated version. I guess that's one way to get your name known to like 3 people. Today you can get Mars 3D for free off of this website, Mars3D-game, which I'll probably leave a link to in the description down below. I appreciate how amateur this site is. It has crazy promises such as huge level, just the one, dive underwater, and fight against enemy waves. I really love that they just use a screenshot with one guy in it for the last one. By the way, I want to mention the fact that the manual doesn't seem to be anywhere on the internet, not even this website, which is unfortunate since I really wanted to see it. The manual currently seems to be lost media, which is vaguely ironic. Anyways, you have to run Mars 3D through DOSBox for it to work. Even with the ancient pagan curse on my bloodline that makes all emulator software incredibly fussy, I still managed to get it running, so it shouldn't be too troubling. This game has no source port, probably because of the unique engine it uses. I'm no expert on this matter, but I've heard, from more technically inclined individuals, that Mars 3D might use a reverse-engineered hybrid of both a build engine and later versions of the Doom engine. This game wears its influences on its sleeve to severely understate how much it borrows from other games, so borrowing code is almost certainly not off that table. The weird history and mutant tech are a big part of this game's charm. About 16 years without seeing the light of day, only to suddenly come back to see a short-lived physical re-release. I can't think of one other game that something like that has happened to. Assuming this isn't a really weird publicity stunt that fell relatively flat, Mars 3D's survival is a small media preservation miracle. However, it serves as a valuable reminder. Media generally gets tossed out for a reason. It's certainly not a terrible game, it just feels like an ancient, obscure total conversion mod rather than something that could have ultimately been on store shelves being bought for kids by their confused grandparents. So let's dive right in. Mars 3D is one of those games that immediately gives me a lot to talk about. Upon booting the game up, you get the CGI intro cutscene that looks like a surrealist bowling alley animation. Aliens, in their nondescript floating circles, are paying a visit to Egypt. I guess they activate a missile launch somehow, probably weak Wi-Fi password, and then they send these missiles slowly drifting over a horrible Photoshop towards a Parisian space needle. This causes Earth to spontaneously combust into big yellow spheres, and that's it. You're at the main menu. Don't worry about the aliens, they won't be acknowledged again until much later on. The real meat here is a prologue you see when you start a new game. As established in the previous cutscene, this game takes place after the nuclear apocalypse. Humanity is rebuilding underground, which apparently means a surface since the world map doesn't exactly look underground. Yeah, big mistake there, guys. In this post-apocalyptic world, one of the most prominent human settlements is Skynet City, which is in space for some reason, like any good underground city. And yes, Skynet City actually is what the game calls it. As it turns out, Skynet government is ridiculously authoritarian and evil. Now, who's here to save us from the Skynet menace? Our hero, Jet Hunter. Jet Hunter. Jet Hunter. Easily the stupidest protagonist name on my channel up to this point. To help him take on his jet-themed Batman alter ego, his parents are massacred by Skynet shortly before the events of the game. Judging from his name, I don't think he has much reason to miss them. In his search for answers, he contacts a resistance movement led by a man named Mars. Yeah, so that's a funny little thing, isn't it? Despite being called Mars 3D, this game overwhelmingly takes place on Earth. It's seemingly named after the guy who gives you orders over the radio. That's unconventional. I honestly couldn't think of a good comparison because when you hear the title Mars 3D, you probably expect a game that takes place on Mars. It's less like if Halo was named Cortana, but more like Halo if Cortana was named Jupiter and the game was called Jupiter 3D. But it's still just Halo with a different name. I've never seen anything quite like this before, and it still kind of shocks me that the title Mars 3D is misleading on top of just being horribly generic. After exchanging some pleasantries, vague objectives, and excessive ellipses with each other, Jet Hunter and Mars part ways for now. I'll come back to the awkward dialogue later because I just want to move on to gameplay. You're thrust right into the first level where you have to find a way to escape the tech-based dreamscape that Jet Hunter somehow got himself stuck in. A lot of things become immediately evident. Particularly the controls. First-person shooter controls were close to the end of the experimental phase at this time. It's one of the things that makes games from this era hard to come back to for me, though I'd say that like this game wasn't canned a handful of years before I was even conceived. As you'd probably expect from a 1997 shooter made in the Far East, Mars 3D didn't actually make any great leaps forward. There's no WASD movement, vertical mouse look, nor strafing by default. You have to adapt the arrow keys, tank controls, and hitting page up and page down to look vertically. This game was made back when humans still had servos in their spines that went whenever they looked up or down. This robotic vertical looking has some gameplay consequences that I'll get to as I move along. For the time being, know that I, Ultimate Turbo Badass Jet Hunter, have the camera in the corner to safely tilt my head up or down before taking on the scary badmen. Mars 3D features the ability to both jump and crouch, which are bound to the A and Z keys respectively. Yeah, how intuitive. Think of it this way, A stands for ascend, and Z stands for Z crouch. Neither of these are useful in most situations, but where they really come into play is the swimming. The swimming is probably the most impressive piece of tech in this game, though it's still a ways behind the curve. It's fake room over room, which is honestly more than I was expecting them to try doing with whatever MacGyvered Frankenstein engine this is. It is very awkward, and the underwater combat has hitches, or fishes as I should say, beyond the controls. Again, I'll get to that soon. Honestly, the worst part of all this for me is simply the layout of the controls. Have a visual and a recap. You move and turn with the arrow keys, you look up and down with the page up and page down keys, respectively, you shoot by hitting left control or left mouse, sprinting is done with shift and wonkily half-functionally toggled with caps lock. Yeah, remember when developers thought games should use caps lock? Interaction is done with the spacebar, and weapons are switched by hitting their respective number keys, with weapon slots going up to 0. Taken all together, this can be a rough mess. Think about how your fingers stretch when you try to switch to a weapon deeper within your roster. If your hands are on left control and the arrow keys, how are you gonna hit the 0 key? Unless you've got massive hands or you're Stretch Armstrong after being processed through a condom factory, it's just not gonna be comfortable. Similarly, if you want to look up at a ceiling turret, you effectively have to take your fingers off the movement keys. Thanks to the tank controls, your turning abilities are comparable to that of a toddler, a problem that comes up in every fight in the game. You can strafe, but you have to be holding down the Alt key. I didn't really use this feature because at this point it felt like my brain was being unraveled and defiled. It's one more drop in the bad controls bucket. Everything feels ever so slightly bogged down or overly complicated. These controls are simply outdated, clumsy, and, in my opinion, the worst thing about the game. I've commented before that I have trouble adapting to bad controls. I was able to manage with Mars 3D, so it's not unspeakably awful, but it's hard not to hate the wonkiness that unnecessarily underpins every second of the game. And yes, you can rebind it outside of the game, but personally I wanted the vanilla Mars 3D experience. Marsnilla, as all 4 fans of this game, assuming they exist at all, call it. With controls out of the way, I have to address this game's presentation. It's different. I mean, when a first-person shooter's crosshairs are both off-center and misaligned, you know you're in for a ride. But beyond that, if you're modestly experienced with first-person shooters, you'll be quick to notice a lot of little things. Stolen textures, sounds taken from other games, inspired designs, and so forth. This game is one heck of an asset treasure hunt, like stolen asset I Spy with a first-person shooter glued onto it. Given the corner of the world this game was developed in, they probably didn't care. Even beyond the plagiarism, the presentation is just special. Just have a snippet of the very first fight, and imagine it stretching out across the rest of the game's runtime. Honestly, I love this. It is so terrible that it wraps back around to becoming good. To clarify, the Shadow the Hedgehog impersonation is coming from the goons and not Jet Hunter. Imagine your last words being, "Kiss my ass." Okay, that's enough imagining for today. Now, I always complain about omnipresent sound design like this, and yeah, Mars 3D is objectively bad with its soundscape. This game is an earworm, not in the sense that it's catchy, but in that it's crawling, slithering, and sliming right around inside of your precious ear hole. The library of sounds is minuscule, horribly mixed, prone to overlapping, and often out of place. I would demo more, but I think that brief taste I already gave you says it all. Shockingly, this isn't the worst sound design I've seen on my channel, but it's certainly the most obnoxious on a moment-to-moment basis. On the flip side, what I do appreciate is the music. It's certainly nothing spectacular and I wouldn't go out of my way to listen to it, but I never got sick of it. It's this fairly mellow set of tracks, perfectly suitable for wandering the levels and sometimes fighting some bad guys. I guess that's a plus, I didn't hate the music. And back to the visuals, they've aged pretty badly. A lot of shooters from this era are hideously dull to look at, and this game is no exception. A couple levels are standout for actually looking fairly decent, particularly the subway station level. Beyond that, expect grey and brown tech-based corridors without much to make them stand out. If there's one good thing I can say, there is a pleasant tinge of abstraction to the levels. I do like the architecture from games of this era, since it's always so weird, nonsensical, and impractical. Definitely an acquired taste thing though, and it doesn't redeem the game from otherwise being visually duller than a spoon's underside. And as I mentioned much earlier, the engine is a janky chimera. As a result, you have hiccups like phasing through reality and witnessing the mysterious black dancing pixels. There's probably a lot more that I didn't catch, find noteworthy, or process as a glitch in the first place. It's seemingly unstable, but it only crashed on one level, so I guess it at least consistently works. Honestly, I find it impressive that a haphazard hybrid of the build and Doom engines is this stable. Not necessarily saying that it is stable, just that it's amazing that it doesn't collapse from a weak breeze blowing on it. Enemy designs are mostly passable, though they're generic and under-animated. They're across the board in terms of quality and, for better or worse, they contrast against the environments really harshly. Weapon designs feel like an odd grab bag, but they're fairly original and consistent with the grounded sci-fi aesthetic that I think they're going for. Admittedly, I quite like some of the weapon sprites. There are also some welcome little details like the presence of gibbing animations and all of the weapons having unique projectiles and explosions when applicable. Ultimately, I think Mars 3D is somewhat subpar visually. The sprite work isn't bad when it's not stolen, but the levels in the color scheme are overwhelmingly rather bland. There's not too much distinguishing this game from most other cheap shooters at the time. By the way, I like the level intermission map. I feel like they trace a little over Doom's Inferno map, but it's mostly original otherwise. There are animated transitions between the levels, which is nifty. I'm honestly surprised they actually went out of their way to make something like this, especially when it's borderline a blink and you'll miss it affair. I personally quite appreciate it. It's finally time to talk about gameplay. Mars 3D mostly plays like any other first-person shooter of the time. Fixed health, a variety of bad guys to shoot, a comically oversized arsenal, and abstract levels about finding secrets and keys. I'll be gradually covering all of this from this point onward. Everything I said about the controls still applies, so keep that in the back of your mind. I do need to elaborate on the health system because it's one of the biggest symptoms of Mars 3D's weird, possibly unfinished design. You have a fixed amount of HP starting at 100 that can only be healed by walking over health kits scattered about the maps. Well, there's a caveat, and it's the fact that you can permanently overcharge your health up to 500 points. The game was almost certainly balanced around you only having about 100, so constantly having 5 times that is pretty ridiculous. Healing is far from rare, especially in the first half of the game. A lot of enemies outright drop health kits. Compound that with all the kits sprinkled throughout the levels, and you're effectively almost immortal. Even on the hardest difficulty, most enemies dish out extremely minuscule chip damage, so there's little threat. To summarize, you can easily accumulate up to 500 health in a game where the average enemy struggles to deal more than 5 damage per second to you. Ultimately, Mars 3D is rather trivial. My only death was self-inflicted with help from the arguable worst enemy in the game. So yeah, game's a pushover. Mars 3D also has a pretty standard roster of goons, perhaps the most generic on my channel up to this point actually. To summarize, you've got a couple ranks of soldiers in addition to turrets, crabs, fish, and super out of place walker robots and mutants. If you've played the original Doom, then congratulations! You've already fought more refined versions of most of Mars 3D's gallery of rogues. I don't have too much to say about them overall. There's funny little things like the turrets that shoot the world's slowest bullet hell at you and the mutants that sit still and spew gunk at you, making them honorary turrets with bonus fecal crust. Nothing here is really notable in the grand scheme of enemy design. However, I do want to talk about the crabs and the fish. The crabs are horrible little creatures who have evidently formed some kind of alliance with Skynet. They're these absurdly tiny, dinky things that camouflage into the environment, you know, like crabs are known for doing. They hit harder than bullets, which greatly adds to the immersion. The only positive concession is that, in a shocking act of game design generosity, you don't need to look down to hit them. They also die pretty easy. The fish are the same general thing, just crammed into the underwater sections instead of randomly being spewed about the level. They come in numbers, move at ridiculous speed, eat a lot of punishment, and have weirdly good pathfinding. Skynet is clearly putting something in the water, and it's turbo steroids. I feel like the fish are the worst of the two, but it's hard to say for sure. Speaking of fish, swimming is very awkward. It's also slightly dizzying because they did that Quake visual distortion filter that I hate. Anyways, it's a relatively common gimmick because it's basically the only trick this game has up its sleeve. Like I said before, A to ascend, Z to descend. It works, albeit clumsily, if you're using the control key to shoot. Clumsy controls aren't great when you're up against large numbers of the arguable worst enemy in the game. These segments are at least fairly short, but it was one hell of a wake-up call when I encountered the first fish. After all, it's probably the hardest fight in the game. Though there's another little interesting quirk to the swimming in this game, and it's that Jet Hunter has an absolutely ludicrous, if not infinite, lung capacity. I thought the original Turok gave you a pretty absurd amount of time underwater. Well, here comes Mars 3D, where you may literally have water breathing. Jet Hunter must have chosen Argonian in character creation. I idled underwater for 4 minutes straight and nothing happened. You get these random bubbles, but I don't think they mean anything. If you can last 4 minutes underwater, then I think it's safe to estimate this as being infinite. Knowing this, there's markedly less tension to these underwater sections. They may as well be temporary flight sections with an aquatic theme. It's also stupidly easy to get stuck underwater. I needed to vertically wiggle my way out of the walls just about every other time I went for a swim. This is almost certainly something to do with the absurdly hacky room over room tech they have here. But who knows? Oh, and you may be wondering what this radial marker on the HUD does. The truth is, I have absolutely no idea. It doesn't point towards your objectives, or at least the exit door, and it doesn't seem to point north either, but rather in a weird diagonal direction. Even if that is north, it's not like knowing what direction is north would help here. It's ultimately cosmetic. I'll give the game the benefit of a doubt and assume that it's an unfinished feature, but who knows what the plan was. Feel free to leave your theories in the comments below. The best part of Mars 3D, maybe aside from its wacky storyline, is its arsenal. They put a decent amount of effort into it, though it's pretty terribly balanced. Your weapons are overpowered across the board, with a select few exceptions. Ammo is fairly rare for most weapons, seemingly to counterbalance this. It's no survival horror, though it's definitely stingier than average. It doesn't matter too much when half the weapons in the game are capable of one-shotting anyways, and that's on hard mode. Anyways, the first weapon you get is the Uzi. This is the weapon I use the most throughout my playthrough. It's a reliable, hard-hitting, fully automatic hit-scan weapon that totally isn't just a resprite of the pistol from Duke 3D. Because it's hit-scan, it has a unique quirk of its rounds effectively homing in vertically, which is pretty true to life. To compound all of that, ammo for this thing is everywhere. It may as well grow on trees. Most of the soldier enemies drop up with 30 rounds for it on death, which is usually a pretty huge profit. Honestly, I love this thing. I know this would be kind of a bold statement, but I think it may outright be the best pistol in any shooter of this era. Something about it tickles me in the right places. Wait, don't misinterpret that. Up next are the Tesla gun and freeze gun, which are so similar that I'm grouping them together. Both are projectile weapons that 1 to 2 shot most enemies in a game. I think the primary distinction between the two is that the freeze gun fires slower but has a small blast radius. I'm not completely sure. In a clever reference to this game's title, the freeze gun doesn't actually seem to freeze things. The projectiles are a big downside for both of these weapons because if you need to hit something in the air, you need to manually adjust Jet Hunter's crooked neck. They're still powerful, but this is certainly an obnoxious inconvenience. Then you have a weapon that is extremely unique for the time, the nerve gun. Enemies you hit with it will join your side and start infighting with their allies. If you use it on a lone enemy, they realize catgirls will never be real and thus let you give them some lumps to death. It's not that useful, especially because of its limited ammo and niche use, yet it's a fun and novel concept. The novelty does die down a bit when you remember that you can just make enemies infight in Doom without a fancy gadget like this. Oh well. A flamethrower is part of your arsenal in this game. So you know how video game flamethrowers typically suck doo-doo? Yep, this is one of the most overpowered weapons I've ever used in a first-person shooter. I think this has to be an unintentional running gag at this point, where I keep playing jank or obscure shooters with genuinely good flamethrowers. It's not something I can predict or account for in advance, it just keeps happening. One single puff from this beast instantly kills everything but the final boss. Everything. Compound that with its massive area of effect and piercing ability, and you have a game-breakingly powerful weapon. I genuinely had a hard time believing what I was seeing when I first whipped it out. Though you do have to be careful, cause using it in tight spaces deals weird self-damage without any visual cues. Doesn't ruin it, it's still stupid potent. It's no wonder these things aren't a war crime when they deal so much damage.
I can take it. I can take it.
And yes, it still does work underwater. Attention to detail isn't exactly Mars 3D's strong suit. Grenades are an interesting, perhaps ambitious inclusion. They're some of the most awkward grenades I've ever used. It's like tossing a bowling ball on the moon after attending the Looney Tunes School of Physics. You don't have much control over the throwing arc, which is a shame because these things actually do pretty good damage. They work, but they're about as clunky as they can possibly be. Duke did it a lot better a year prior. The 7th weapon slot is the disc gun. It just shoots low damaging discs that you can retrieve, and that's about it. It's just a quirky weapon that is greatly outmatched by every other weapon. That's all I have to say about this thing. And the game sometimes decides that you can't retrieve the discs, so it's not even all that reliable. You then have 2 rocket launchers for some reason. The first one is this weird steampunk BFG that looks completely out of place. It's a pretty standard rocket launcher beyond that, those ammo's survival horror level scarce and there's an odd second long delay on firing it. It is rendered completely obsolete by the second rocket launcher, the homing rocket launcher. Yeah, it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's the same thing, including that firing delay, but it also homes in. And yes, it does home in vertically. Because the rockets home in like Revenant missiles, you can practically fire and forget with this thing, which is a pretty huge deal. Who doesn't love a gun that aims for you? Also, the design is far less ugly. I feel like I've seen this sprite before, but I just can't place it. And lastly, the ultimate weapon. The weapon you've been eagerly anticipating, the last in slot, your fists. You start the game with your fists, which is good because Jet Hunter wouldn't be able to shoot guns otherwise. Would be bad if he couldn't do that. A little weird they put your melee weapon into the 0 slot when it's super conventional to bind it to 1, you know, the button borderline on the opposite side of most keyboards. But whatever. Hilariously, melee is a 100% reliable stun lock. Punching your foes to death saves a lot of ammo in some sections. The only downside to it is that you have to put up with how much Jet Hunter groans while he's fisting men. Yes, Jet Hunter shares his voice with the generic goons you gun down by the dozens. Individuality is frowned upon in the grand universe of Mars 3D. What more can I say about the arsenal? It's definitely rather interesting overall. Between multiple weapons filling nearly identical roles and most of them one-shotting enemies, there's a lot of redundancy here. Besides that, it's a somewhat milquetoast arsenal that doesn't stray too far from 90s FPS convention. I guess I'm a little neutral on the arsenal overall. It could be a fun, interesting arsenal with more balancing and distinct weapon roles, but there is unique, memorable charm to Mars 3D being this weird power fantasy. Realizing how ridiculously overpowered my weapons were really kept me going. I tend to hate bullet sponges, but Mars 3D leans a bit too far in the opposite direction. Everything I sneeze at immediately dies. It's part of the reason why I like the Uzi so much, because it simply feels relatively well balanced. Compound that with a really generous health system, and I guess it's better to just double down and hand me a flamethrower that deals BFG levels of damage. Spices things up in more ways than one, I suppose. Now I'm just gonna start going through the campaign, talking about the level design and story. The two are quite deeply interconnected, which is what I would say if I was to lie to you. It's one of those games where the story is just a vague way to connect the levels. The level design itself is generally what you'd expect from a mid-grade 90s shooter. It's rather linear in comparison to its contemporaries and doesn't ask too much in the way of backtracking or maze wandering. It still does have those things, but levels are relatively navigable and easy to understand. Mars 3D's linearity honestly pushes it slightly above most other mediocre 90s shooters, where bad and unintuitive level design is often a huge point of contention, at least for me. Mars 3D is relatively modern, with points of no return within levels, story objectives, cutscenes between missions, and frequent side passages for scavenging for resources. Otherwise, it's a relatively archetypical corridor shooter of the time. Like most others, it sometimes breaks away from that, but ultimately, most fights take place in long enclosed rectangular spaces, aka corridors. You can tell they wanted some little bits of spice here and there, and that's part of the reason why they put swimming in. Swimming through tight rectangular spaces. I at least commend the level design for being experimental at times and relatively serviceable otherwise. Only a select few sections were outright unpleasant, and I'll talk about them as I get to them. Beyond that, Mars 3D also has stereotypical boomer shooter features like secrets and keycards. It's lighter on the latter than most, thankfully. It has that weird level design quirk where keycards are often within spitting distance of the door they open. It's bad level design, yet it does reduce the arbitrary key hunting, so I think it averages out. On the other hand, secrets run a bizarre gamut from being ridiculously hidden to being in plain sight. Some levels I couldn't find any, in others I was tripping over them on accident. They're generally worth looking for, especially thanks to the ammo scarcity I mentioned before. Basically every weapon in the game shows up early in secrets, so that's cool. They're lucrative, but not too lucrative, which I think makes them pretty good secrets. Anyways, level 1 kinda sucks. Jet Hunter just kinda wakes up in a bunch of utility tunnels. It starts off passable though. The introductory fights are pretty fun where you just get to charge down a corridor mowing everything down with a genuinely satisfying Uzi. You're also pretty quickly plunged into the first swimming section featuring the nightmare fish and a Tesla rifle that someone accidentally dropped at the bottom of these miscellaneous water tunnels. There's an ambush you can wipe out in advance at the end of the swimming section. I generally have a fondness of circular design like this, but there's an obnoxious amount of random dead ends everywhere and the pacing is messy. Speaking of messy, we're already to the single worst section of the game, the sewer. This may be one of the worst sewers I've ever seen. It's dim, ugly, confounding, and full of mutants. So it's like me, but slightly worse. I spent longer than I would like to admit wallowing in feces here. Thank goodness the auto map is actually quite decent. I would have been stuck here for a very long time otherwise. The end of the level is a piranha pool dunk tank where it's better to just dash to the exit than actually fight back. I guess you get into this toy truck and you're off to the next level. The end of level cutscene calls it a van, which must mean that Jet Hunter's uncle came to pick him up. Like most other shooters of the era, Mars 3D has end-of-level stats. I didn't get many 100% in these, but in my defense, this game loves hiding both secrets and bad guys in esoteric optional areas. So have fun with your 100%. I love these intermission cutscenes. They're often rather dry, but the slightly slapdash translation gives them some charm. The game was definitely not translated by native English speakers, and I don't necessarily fault them for that. It's the same case as The Hunt, where it's largely legible, but there are a plethora of amusing typos, tense swaps, and other little mistakes. A lot of dialogue feels rather stilted, robotic, and unnatural. So many ellipses, and tons of things that nobody would ever actually say. My personal favorite is the first line Mars says, which is, "My condolences to you for the loss of your parents, but no one can be reborn after death, and there is something more important waiting for you to complete." Who says that? Still, despite it obviously not being a professional job, you can get a rough picture of what is happening in the story. Speaking of, the story doesn't matter much for the first few levels. Mars is just sending you on vague resistance missions about blowing things up, most importantly blowing Skynet City out of space. I'll come back to it when it decides to take a hard left turn. Level 2 is honestly one of the strangest levels I've seen in a shooter in a while. You have a fairly extensive area at the start that largely doesn't matter. This is somewhat common in Mars 3D. I did say the levels are linear, but they all have a handful of areas you don't even need to visit in order to complete the mission. I have respect for this sort of level design, even if it can make navigation more confusing from time to time. I went back to some levels to gather some extra footage later on and found an impressive number of non-secret areas that I'd missed entirely. This mission in particular is probably 70% optional, which is rather impressive. The only other level rivaling that is the final level. Anyways, for some reason there's a couple random teleporters in one room here. They don't look much like teleporters, but what do I know? If you take them, you get completely locked out of this initial section with no way back. Why? In the next section, you get multiple overly intense fish battles. Look, it's only level 2 of 7. Have some mercy with the Omega Hyper Death Piranhas, please. The final stretch is a long series of level design anomalies. You have another piranha dunk tank which you emerge from to enter the airport baggage claim room. What the intent behind these conveyors was will probably forever be unknown. And then there's this weird pyramid with a red keycard to the red door which is in the same room. What is happening here? What is this level design flow? And who is the visionary madman who designed this? The cherry on top here is the final room, or the final doom as I should call it, because it's filled with stolen doom textures. The floor, the computer walls, the exit door, they didn't hide it very well. Pressing the doom exit button causes Skynet City, totally not an alien UFO by the way, to fall out of space. Wom. Level 3 is alright, it's certainly a highlight of the game. It takes place in the city dreamscape environment that takes a couple notes from Silent Hill. It's one of the few levels that resembles an actual human place, which is something Mars 3D dips its toes into now and again. The architecture is largely abstract tech-based corridors and sewers, but sometimes you get something a lot more distinct and believable. I like that. Old graphics trying to recreate realistic spaces is an aesthetic that I love. Level 3 is also where the arsenal gets quite a bit better. This is where I got stuff like the homing rockets and flamethrower. You can get a jetpack here, which is a funky novelty power-up. It's as clumsy as you'd expect, and a smidge more. You're basically swimming through the air, which I guess is a good analog for flying in general. The developers probably saw the jetpack in Duke 3D and figured that there's no good idea in the world that they couldn't copy, but worse. Of all the levels in Mars 3D, I think this one has the most charm in its layout. Surprisingly competent may be the best way to describe it. The environment has some nice little details, the encounters are a bit more varied, the level has a good open feeling to it, and the secrets are pretty reasonable and satisfying. The jetpack is a nice little mix-up too. By most metrics, this is an above average FPS level, but this is tainted a little bit by the maze at the end. It has you crawling through tons of vent shafts and tiny square rooms while LARPing as the world's tiniest kickboxer because a jetpack naturally makes you veer floorwards. Not forwards, floorwards. This maze is the worst part of the level, but it's certainly more tolerable than the sewer from before. Again, the automap is a lifesaver. I suggest you praise our Lord and Savior, the automap. Anyways, you enter some weird glowy teleporter thing, I have no idea what it is, and that causes the place to, you guessed it, explode violently. And now level 4 is where the story madness kicks in. Mars tells you that Skynet has scientists working on a time machine, and that you need to find it. Yeah, sure, why not? Just toss time travel in. I overwhelmingly hate time travel in media, but with a game like this, I was genuinely curious where it would take things. That's half the appeal of obscure games, you generally don't know what to expect. Anyways, what was the name of that franchise featuring an antagonist called Skynet that weaponizes time travel? Was it RoboCop? Anyways, level 4 is pretty meh. There's not too much special about it beyond its obnoxious use of turrets. And crabs. It blended together enough for me to need to review footage to remember most of it, so I guess this is the obligate forgettable level. It's definitely the most corridorous and gray level the game has on offer. However, this level is where I encountered the only major glitch. Some of the enemies near the end of the level became completely invincible and the game kept crashing, seemingly on a timer. Luring the invincible enemies out and rushing to the time machine, which ends the level, was adequate. Entering the time machine reveals that aliens were behind it all, because we didn't know that at this point. I love how blatantly inspired the design is. They're so obviously elites from Halo. Then you get a word art transition back into the 90s straight out of the 90s. Level 5 takes place in some random subway station in 1999. Real 90s kids will fondly remember the teleporters and random high-tech weaponry sitting around. I'm not sure what that's about, to be honest, and the game ultimately isn't too interested in making any of this make sense. Anyways, this is a pretty good looking level, if a bit weird in some places. Secrets are reasonable and the encounters feel more thought out than average here. More traps and mixtures of enemies. There is this strange part where you enter a utility tunnel through a train car. I'm not an expert, but I don't think that's how it works. This is also one of the shorter levels, effectively being a hunt for the 3 Chaos Emeralds necessary to open some random innocuous door leading to a misaligned Doom texture that's apparently also a time machine. Yeah, all this logic checks out. This map gives you the freedom to tackle the 3 keycards in any order you want, which is another thing I tend to like in level design. Overall, this is my personal favorite level in Mars 3D. The encounters and aesthetic are passable, the layout is easy to understand, and the execution is solid all around. It's an outright decent level in a game otherwise filled with mediocre ones. I could be grading on a curve a little at this point, but I don't know. If you asked me to replay this level 10 times over, or Doom 2's Downtown once, then I would definitely choose to replay this level 10 times over. Now, for level 6, we're paying a visit to the defense network mentioned all the way back in the prologue. It has you fighting these weird walker robots. I'm not sure if these are supposed to be alien or human robots, but either way, they're pushovers. This is the penultimate level, by the way, and it's actually the hardest level in the game. It's overwhelmingly been a bit of a joke up to this point, but they crank up the pain here. It's mostly because this level has just as many crabs as the entire Crab Dance music video. These crabs are placed in massive groups in obnoxious places. Worst of all is a pitch dark corridor with swarms of them. You don't really have an efficient way to deal with hordes of them other than grenades, and I've already mentioned that those are rather unreliable. The flamethrower can easily get you killed in these tight corridors, so that beast is off the table, to an extent. Have I mentioned I hate these crabs? Plus, the way to go is concealed in total darkness at one point, with it only being apparent on the auto map. Screw off with that kind of crap. And how could I not talk about the turret elevator maze? This area is abysmal. So many turrets, so many identical rooms, and a lot of nearly guaranteed damage. It's a third and last proper maze this game has. Thankfully you can fist the turrets on the floor to death, and there's weird 9-ball safe spots under the ceiling turrets. You need to pass through here to reach the level exit, but you can also explore deeper to find the worst weapon in the game, the disc gun. Okay, I'm glad I spent all that time slowly being worn down for this. Once you surmount that gauntlet of depravity, you find Zaker, the missile defense system that gave Earth a nuclear makeover. Jet Hunter, being a master hacker, cures Zaker of its alien virus so they can discuss their alien invasion plans together. Basically, it didn't do it on purpose because it was possessed by aliens. You know, statistically, most people and computers who claim they are forced to do something violent by aliens are not lying. Anyways, it mentions a king alien hanging around in Skynet City, therefore it's time to magically teleport there and show him who's the predator and who's the prey. Oh, that's what he's from, Prey 2006. And now it's the final level, a showdown with a big bad Martian 3D. Well, not quite. The showdown is clumsily stapled onto the end of the level. Also, it's never established if the aliens are from Mars, and Mars himself hasn't been around since level 5. Titular character, by the way. Most of this level is rather weird and it's a bit of a slog, but you at least get a lot of ammo to cut loose. There was a massive area I didn't even find on my blind playthrough, so that's cool. There's also this weird elevator of extreme glitchiness. I'm not sure the engine is up to handle big elevators, but I don't know. I'm actually curious as to what's happening here because none of the other elevators in this game have this problem. This level is ultimately just a flamethrower massacre for me. The aliens are never prepared for me to use a tactic as advanced as fire. And a final boss shows up somewhat abruptly, and he is dreadful. As someone who's played countless first-person shooters, I can say with a lot of confidence that the genre never does bosses well. This fight is terrible, even for the time, and it drags the entire game down. He's nothing more than a damage sponge with rapid onset invincibility. Literally, he just turns invincible on a dime, so he spends half the fight immune to damage. You can determine when he's about to turn invincible by using a mix of your horoscope, the standard model Lagrangian, and good old luck. Good luck timing your shots when most weapons have a delay of some kind, be it slow projectile speed or straight up a firing delay. Grenades are oddly the best weapon to use against him because they do a lot of damage. Unfortunately, he's almost immune to the flamethrower, so I guess the developers knew the fire was pretty hot and didn't want to cheese him too badly. He's rather unthreatening beyond how absurdly long it takes for him to die, and even if you are weakened, there's a ton of health items nearby. This guy is just a miserable, drawn-out pushover, a lame note to end the game on. Once you beat him, which happens before his health bar reaches 0 because this game is really elegantly designed, you get a visit from his fellow aliens. They congratulate you in wingdings. Something like, "You're the ultimate warrior jet, Chad Hunter, wart. And then they just leave Earth, severely demoralized about losing to a guy with the turning capabilities of an infant. Our hero drops his gun dramatically like he approximated gravity to be 9 meters a second squared. Then you get a view of Skynet City flying off into space, and that's the end. 2 seconds of credits before being dropped back into DOS like a sack of potatoes. Yeah, I'm used to it at this point. I guess that's all I get. Shooters of this era are more often than not light on story, but that was pretty bad. Jet Hunter didn't even shit down the alien's neck, come on. Mars 3D's story is charmingly bad, so I can't be too harsh on it. I feel like it takes its schlock ever so slightly too seriously, which gives it some appeal, though I can totally imagine something got lost in translation here. I find it weird that Mars vanishes about 2/3 of the way into the game, and that they decide to immediately reveal that the aliens caused the apocalypse. I feel like they should have saved that reveal for later. It also leaves me with a lot of questions. What happened to the Resistance? Why did the aliens nuke Earth? If it was just for human labor, then what exactly did they need it for? What was the time travel level about? Why did the aliens leave when their leader died? So many questions, so few answers. I'm not expecting a deep web of lore, but can't the bad guy at least have some obvious motivations? I didn't hate Mars 3D's campaign, I kinda liked it in some ways. It's ultimately okay to passable. It has its highs and lows like any other FPS campaign of the era. It's amateurish and old school in a way that often has some charm, though some people might not see the appeal. Beyond that, the select few instances of outright bad level design don't necessarily ruin the game. It's a 2-hour experience anyway, so even if you hate it, it's over quick. The level design isn't winning any awards, but it's overwhelmingly inoffensive. I guess that's good for a cheap 90s shooter. So, Mars 3D. It's this uber obscure, slightly quirky 90s first-person shooter that was narrowly lost to time. In fact, it was lost to time for the better half of 2 decades. I'm not even sure if I could give you a proper verdict because of that. I reviewed it more out of curiosity and for documentation purposes than anything else. I've played worse AAA titles, though that's not saying much. Mars 3D may be a bit clumsy, archaic, and thieving, but it's completely playable and more amusing than frustrating. If you're optimistic, it's a 2-hour retro romp that entertains because of its awkward and questionable design and writing. If you're realistic, it's just an exceedingly mediocre 90s shooter held back by being unfinished, janky, and poorly designed in various places. Had this pharaoh not been dug out of its tomb, then aside from the curse on everyone who found it, the world wouldn't really be any different. I've been oddly positive on it, but honestly I just can't hate this game. Something about it reels me in and I can't explain it. It's a bit like watching a low-speed car crash. It's nothing spectacular, chaotic, or violent, but it can still be amusing to be a witness to. Ultimately, I would recommend it more as a curiosity than anything else. If you're here for your dose of boomer shooter or an actual game to play unironically, then I'd suggest you look for something else. Otherwise, it's an amusing way to kill an afternoon. Mars 3D is only 2-ish hours long, and if you know where to go, you could probably beat it in a shorter amount of time than it takes to watch this video from beginning to end. I couldn't find any documented speedruns out there, so free world record for you guys. Go grab it and come back to tell me about it in agonizing detail. Speaking of free things, Mars 3D itself is free, being an unholy trio of vaporware, abandonware, and freeware in that order. So hey, it's not gonna cost you much. I certainly got value for my money out of the 2 playthroughs I did for the sake of this video. I guess that's the episode. Tune in next time for something. I've got a small list of things I want to cover next, but I'll have to see what I end up getting to first. See you then.
Hunter, you're looking good.
Wow.